Hello YouTube, this is David on behalf of Godsman00, also known as DC7845. Today we discuss the 5th installment to our Vanguard retrospective. We'll be taking a look at Booster Set 05, Awakening of Twin Blades, easily one of the most impactful sets in this game's history. Set 5 would mold the entire metagame of the Japan format for the year of 2012. Some of these cards would see play even into early G, 2015 to 2016 for those not familiar. Awakening of Twin Blades was released on January 14th, 2012 in Japan, and we would receive it in English a little over a year later on February 22nd of 2013. See episode 3 to understand why there's a 13-month gap here. With 80 different cards, this set would support a grand total of 10 different clans. I'm going to quickly run through these because there's a lot of them. Royals, Kaguro, OTT, Nova Grappler, DI, Pale Moon, Shadow Paladins, DP, Murakumo, Neo Nectar. Neo Nectar had the most support, provided with 22 cards, not terribly surprising considering it's a brand new clan. Murakumo came in second with 18 new cards. It would have been a new clan, but it actually already had 4 cards of support from Extra Booster 1 prior to this set. See the last video if you want to know anything about Extra Booster 1. Royal Paladin and the Shadow Paladin clan would both get 8 new cards. However, Royals would actually get 9 in English, and the remaining 6 cards would receive 4 cards of support, with the exception being Kaguro, who got a 5th card in the English set. The cover of this set would feature the 3 main characters for the finale of the first season of the anime, Aichi, Rin, and Kai, alongside the new Royal Paladin boss unit, Majesty Lord Blaster. More on this monster of a card later. The English version of this set, as already stated, got 2 extra cards, one for Kaguro and one for Royals. That was Conjurer of Mithril and Demonic Dragon Mage Mahoraga. Apologies if I mispronounced that. But honestly, neither are really worth looking at, because they're not very good, so we're just going to kind of skip over them for now. Neo Nectar and Murakumo would not be blessed or cursed, depending on how you look at it, with ride chains this set. Instead, the new mechanics we got in Set 5 was Persona Blast and Cross Ride. Persona Blast was more of a specific cost rather than a mechanic. On certain grade 3 units from this set, we'd have some powerful skills that required you to discard copies of the same card name as the unit using the skill to activate those effects. Examples include Dragonic Overlord the End or Maiden of Trailing Rose. This was an interesting way to utilize extra grade 3s in hand, and these skills were normally pretty strong and worth using. Cross Ride was one of the other new mechanics introduced here. More than anything, it's really just cool to say. It's not a super flashy skill. It just says that if specific grade 3 or just specific cards in general are in soul, you would get an additional 2k continuously. And this was very, very strong because this worked both on your turn as well as your opponent's turn. It would turn 11k base Vanguards into 13, or 10k base Vanguards, the one of 10k base Vanguard, into a 12k base. And since it was continuous, working on both players' turns was just so phenomenal for defense. Keep in mind, rearguard columns were much smaller during this time period. The common 15k or 16k rearguard lines that you could form previously would only require 5k guard, making it just drastically easier to play defensively. However, unfortunately, only 3 clans were blessed with this skill, unlike Persona Blast, which actually a few different clans would get, but in this set, only 3 clans got that cross-ride skill, and they were all good. So we'll get back to that in a little bit. So, apologies in advance. This is an incredibly impactful set, so when I'm talking about the best cards, it is going to take a little bit. It's definitely a lengthier list than normal, and we're going to save some of the best stuff for last. So let's go ahead and just kick things off with Murakumo. Murakumo is our ninja clan, and their gimmick was supposed to mimic ninja techniques. They had 2 concepts. One was calling copies of rearguards from the deck, but the copies will go to the bottom during the end phase. This is, I guess, shadow cloning or whatever, that kind of thing. And then the second part was a defensive technique that allowed you to discard a copy of your main grade 3, aka Persona Ride, in order to lower the power of an attacking unit. Some kind of mirage technique, I guess. Apologies for my lack of knowledge regarding ninjas. Million Rat, Midnight Crow, and Void Gelga are examples of this cloning technique. They all shared the same skill. When you place them on Rearguard Circle, you can counterblast 1, search your deck for a copy of that card, and call it to Rearguard Circle. At the end of the turn, the called card would return to the bottom of the deck. This did 2 things. Number 1, it removed a normal unit from the deck. This increased your trigger chances. And since it returned to the bottom of the deck during the end phase, those trigger chances would remain positive for you. Number 2, it allowed you to conserve on cards from hand, but still attack efficiently. In theory, this is actually really, really nice. However, they didn't really do much after you placed them on Rearguard Circle. They just kind of sat there and they had lower base stats. Million Red had 6k, Midnight Crow had 8k, Void Gelga had 9. If you're familiar with the time period, those are about 1k short of what you would normally see on Rearguards from this time period. But there's a little caveat to this because we got a forerunner in this set called Evil Ferret. Now, Evil Ferret is a card that says you can put it on the bottom of the deck, and you can call a card from your hand and then return it to your hand during the end phase. So this allowed you to kind of abuse those on-play skills because they would bounce back to your hand. This was obviously meant to work with those cloners. And now another thing to note about this is since it is a special call, not a normal call, you could call grade 3s even when you're on grade 1. See, Evil Ferret was free. So if you really wanted to, you could call cards like Void Gelga from your hand on your grade 2 turn and then get a second Void Gelga and have like a full front row of decent numbers even as early as that, and then the Void Gelga bounces back to your hand. You could reuse it on your grade 3 turn. So that was just a nice little offensive advantage that this clan had. It had a little bit of actually really nice early game in the early days of Murakumo, and that was basically like one of its best assets in the early days. Now we're going to talk about the other kind of gimmick this clan had, and that was Mandala Lord. He's not terribly good. He was the main boss of the clan at the time, and his skill would reflect that second half, that mirage technique. At the beginning of the guard step, when he is attacked, you can counterblast 1, discard a copy of himself, aka a Persona Blast, to reduce the power of the unit attacking it by 10,000 until the end of the battle. This effectively turns your spare copies of itself into 10k guards, which is kind of interesting, but it costed a counterblast, which is a tad restrictive. You also had to see a second copy of him, so even that in its own, if you think about it, if you don't ever see the second copy, this card kind of doesn't do anything, and that's not what you want from your clan's main boss unit. It did have 11k base, so I'll give it that, but now you did have 2 cards that kind of help fetch extra copies of himself. Admittedly, they weren't very good, but you had both Stealth Dragon Cursed Breath and Stealth Dragon Turbulent Edge. They had the same skill, Cursed Breath being a grade 2, Turbulent Edge is a grade 1. When their attack hits a Vanguard, you can look at the top 5 cards of the deck for a Mandala Lord and add it to your hand. Now, the grade 1 didn't say when an attack that it boosted hits. It really says when its attack hits Vanguard. So you have to somehow hit your opponent's Vanguard with a grade 1. And it didn't help that they had lower base power. Cursed Breath had 8k and Turbulent Edge had 6k. Very hard to hit with these cards, but in the end, Murakumo just kind of remained interesting in concept, but not super great. Quite a few of their cards, like I said prior, they had lower base power. This struggled in a cross-ride meta where we had higher base powers on Vanguard. But speaking of cross-rides, it did kind of have a quote anti-cross-ride unquote card, but not from set 5. It actually came from Extra Booster 1. See the previous video again if you want to know more about Extra Booster 1. We were introduced to Dueling Dragon Zambaku, a fairly nice grade 3 that forced your opponent to discard a card at the beginning of the ride phase if you wish to ride on top of the grade 3. certainly not the monster that we got in V, but it definitely was like interesting for decks that wanted to re-ride grade 3s. Now, granted, of the cross-ride meta, there was only one deck that actually wanted to ride a grade 3 on top of a grade 3, so not terribly impactful. The other two could achieve cross-rides by other means, so we'll talk about that later. Now let's discuss Neo Nectar. Now Neo Nectar actually had a pretty solid base. There's not like I don't want to spend too much time talking about Neo Nectar because it is actually just very basic. But as far as like they had a bunch of clones from other clans like Sunlight or Lady of the Sunlight Forest, Glass Beads Dragon, Spiritual Tree Sage, Airman Soul. They were all clones of pre-existing cards. It also came with a Rainbow Trigger lineup and overall felt like a more standardized clan released at that point. There was no funny gimmicks or weird trigger ratios that a lot of other clans had to deal with at that time. So Neo Nectar had a very basic mechanic too. It was just a swarm deck. So let's kind of like dig into some of these cards. Let's start with the Gene series, because the Gene series was, they didn't get a ride chain. They instead got this weird on-hit chain that worked on Rearguard Circle. So basically you have your Forerunner, which is Shield Seed Squire. And he was the only Forerunner you had, so you had to deal with it. But he had a very simple skill. When his attack hits, you can return it to deck, and then search a copy of Blade Seed Squire from the deck, and call it at rest. So no, it didn't generate a multi-attack, but it would basically turn the 0 into a 1. And the grade 1 did have the same skill, essentially. If the grade 1's attack hits, you can turn it to the deck, and then you could call Night Averter Gene, which was essentially a grade 2 copy of that, and the grade 2 would turn into a grade 3. You get the idea. They all had to hit. They all did it for free, admittedly, but they all had to hit, and they were all plus or minus zeros. They just turned themselves, they essentially just upgraded upwards. And now, getting your Forerunner to hit isn't going to work a lot, but it's a cool concept in theory. The grade 3 had a unique on-hit skill as well, allowed it to turn itself into the two grade 2 genes. That's Night of Harvest gene would go back down into the 2 copies of Night Averter gene. So essentially, the grade 3 was a +1 because you would turn a 3 into 2 2s, but in the end, these were all on-hit effects, so that there's problems there, but also, like, it's kind of not worth it. Like, if you really wanted to get the Night of Harvest Gene's effect off, just play Night of Harvest Gene. Like, you didn't really have to go up the chain, you could just call it to Rearguard Circle. Like, it's just not, there's no reason to go up the chain, but it was a cool concept, and I really do like that conceptually, and they did eventually get a grade 1 called Fruit Baskets Elf, which allowed you to, basically an attack that it boosted, hits regardless of power, but it doesn't deal damage. So it was, it was there to help you trigger those skills, the on-hit skills, but not super good. Now let's actually talk about a good card that the clan got, because Maiden of Trailing Rose was a really good card. Trailing Rose came with a nice 11k base, which was very strong at the time, very simple but a strong skill. On Vanguard Circle, when its attack hits, you can counterblast 1, discard a copy of itself, yet another Persona ride. Then you can look at top 5 cards of your deck, call 2 Neo Nectars from among them to Rearguard Circle. Now, you can view this one of 2 ways. One, it's +2 to board, technically a +1 because you're discarding a card from your hand, or it's multi-attack, and either way it was fantastic for a single counterblast. Now unfortunately it was locked behind an on-hit, but it was pretty strong pressure back then when guarding the Vanguard swing every turn was actually quite difficult due to the lack of plussing. So it was actually a very decent clan out the gate. You had a decent boss unit, you had a bunch of solid generic cards, and you weren't struggling with any weird funky gimmicks for the most part. You didn't even have to play the Gene cards if you didn't want to. They had an 11k attacker like Hey Yo Pineapple. We're not going to talk too much about that, but definitely best name in the clan, right? Just to note, though, it was popular enough to be featured in team events alongside MLB and Dota very early in Japanese Set 5 meta. So it very quickly dropped, but it had a little bit of a showing at that first competitive team event. I believe they called it the Trio Festival or something like that. It's in early 2012. You can look it up, but it had a few different tops there with MLB and Dota. So that's it for the 2 new clans. So now we get to just talk about pre-existing support, because we had 8 existing clans supported here, very different than the other videos that we talked about where it's just mainly been a lot of new clans and Q4 support. Now we have 8 clans being supported here, and they're not all Q4 decks. Very cool. So Dimensional Police got supported, and it wasn't super impactful, but it offered a new kind of playstyle for Dimensional Police. Miracle Beauty was a triple R for whatever reason, and it kind of felt more like a Nova Grappler card. On rearguard circle only, when it stands during the battle phase, you can restand a rearguard in the same column as it. So it turns stand trigger into a column restand, which, okay, it did get a new stand trigger in the set. It wasn't terrible, so alright. And then it also worked with Enigman Rain from BTO4, a card that says if it reached 12k power and its attack hits, you can restand a Dimensional Police rearguard. So again, just offering just a different kind of play style for Dimensional Police. It's probably not really that good, but it was at least interesting that there was 2 different play styles and you didn't have to just solely focus on playing one way or another. So DP really did need crits though, and it didn't get another crit. Sad face. Super Dimensional Robo Die Lady was very, very close to being a good card. On rearguard circle is 9k base grade 2. If his attack hits, she would give 3k power to another Dimensional Police unit. Had this been 4k, this would have been a much more playable card. I guess they thought that an on-hit to turn on your Dayusha or Enigman Storm would have been too good. I don't know why they thought that, but it would have been much, much better had it been 4K. But because it wasn't, it was just a pretty mad card. So, you know, just some weird design choices for Dimensional Police, nothing new. And we're going to move on because it didn't really do a whole lot. So let's go ahead and touch on AL4 before I get to Q4. Dark Irregulars got some actually very interesting cards here. Some just better quality of life stuff. No Life King Death Anchor was a pseudo ultimate break, not the broken V card. We're not going to talk about that here. But it was released as a promo during this time, and it had an 11k base once you reached 8 cards and sold. That's continuous, so it works on both players' turns. That was nice. I feel like they definitely needed a good 11k base. It's soul charged once per turn. That's basically all it was used for. It had a pretty interesting ultimate break. It wasn't very good. You just used it for a soul charge every turn to get to that 11k base, hang out for a bit, and then once you felt like you could close the game, you rode on Ammon and swung for a really big number. So that was, you know, not super great. It wasn't a super great strategy, but it existed. Beelzebub was the grade 3 released in the core set here. It shared that same continuous skill as NLK. If you had 8 or more in soul, it gained an extra 1k continuously. Now its on attack skill was not very good. Counterblast 2 is way too hefty for such a mediocre effect. But you know, I guess it was okay. But anyways, we're not going to talk too much about Beelzebub. He wasn't really a big player here. You'd rather run NLK because, you know, it is soul charged once per turn. And that was all you really needed it for. Dark Soul Conductor had a Guardian Circle skill, very rare for this time. When sent from Guardian Circle to drop, you soul charge 2. There wasn't a lot of good soul charge options in DI. As previously discussed, surprisingly, you wouldn't think that being Dark Irregulars, but it really didn't have a lot of good options yet. So this was actually quite decent. It's also see some you'd see a few spots teched into early Bladewing lists in G, because it interacted very nicely with Sullivan. Of course, Bladewing's got much better cards later, so we'll get to that when we get to it. But it was just, I felt like it was worth mentioning here. It was a pretty decent card. Now, Hysteric Shirley was probably one of the best draw triggers this clan ever got. It was actually just a very nice card. The clan lacked a lot of draw power, a lot of plussing in general, so getting a draw trigger was definitely welcome. But it also had a great skill. It allowed you to move into soul and soul charge 1, effectively netting 2 more soul. So, this is fixing 2 problems in 1 card. A, it's a draw trigger, which the clan needed, and 2, it gave you more soul. So, that just helped in both ways, in ways that the clan really needed at that time. The only thing this clan really needed now was a new boss unit, because Ammon, not gonna cut it. Not that great of a card. However, it's gonna be a long time before we get a new good boss unit for this clan. We'll come back to that later, but yeah. Pale Moon also got some love here with Mistress Hurricane. You'll see coming up, especially in Limit Break era, you'll see this kind of card design more often. These grade 3 units that say on place, Counterblast 2, get a +1. You'll see that more often as we go into Limit Break era. It actually became kind of a thing, but this was one of the first instances of that. Certainly not as good as the Limit Break ones we'd get later, but this was one of the first instances of it. Similar to Beelzebub and NLK, it gained a continuous 1k if you had 8 or more in souls. Surprisingly, a lot. Well, I guess not surprisingly, but unsurprisingly, a little bit harder to do than DI. But when you place it on Vanguard Circle, you Counterblast 2, call 1 card from your soul. It's a simple +1, but it's actually very good for the time. It actually incentivized rewriting her to get more pluses. So that was nice. If you thought Counterblast was an issue, don't worry. Sky High Walker's got you covered. The new stand trigger said you can move from Rearguard Circle into Soul to unflip 1 card or from your damage zone, aka a counter charge now. This would see actually really good usage in a few decks later, just being a generic stand to countercharge with. It was a very nice card. You even saw it in very restrictive archetypes like Silverthorns. If you ever look, there's a Silverthorn list that did really, really well back during Break Right era. They played this card despite it not being a Silverthorn because countercharge was just that good. But other than that, there's not really a lot to talk about here. It was nice getting a stand, just because, restanding cards like Nightmare Doll Alice to provide more on-hit pressure was good. The deck definitely didn't need 2 draw triggers that it came with in set 3, but alas, it just improved. It was a minor improvement, but it did improve the clan's playability, which was pretty nice. So now let's talk about the big baddie. As expected, of AL4's leader, Shadow Paladin received a very strong buff here. Phantom Blaster Overlord was the exciting evolution of Phantom Blaster Dragon, our first cross-ride unit on this list. Boasting a solid 11k base, if Phantom Blaster Dragon was in the soul, it continuously gained an extra 2k power, putting it at a 13k base offensively or defensively. This was great for a clan that produced such good card advantage. It also had a Persona Blast for a Steep Counterblast 3. You could discard a copy of itself to gain 10k power. Definitely better than Phantom Blaster Dragon, but still way too steep. When you have so many cards that counterblast like Maka and Nemain, your Cursed Lancer's not going to consistently get you that counter charge, so it may be a little too steep. You probably still didn't activate this skill, but just being a 13k base was good enough for the clan at this time. It really did carry this. You could even get the cross ride a turn early. One neat little play you could do was you could ride Overlord first on turn 3. Then you can use Nightmare Painter, a new grade 1 from this set that says on place, you can take a card from your hand and put it into your soul. So you could actually take Phantom Blaster Dragon, the original, from your hand and put it into soul. Granted, this is a 3-card combo. You had to ride Overlord, call a Nightmare Painter, and have a Phantom Blaster Dragon in soul, or in your hand to put into soul. But this was really neat. Pretty cool interaction that you could actually cross-ride a turn early. We'd actually see Misaki do something similar to this in the anime in Limit Break era by shoving a Amaterasu into the soul with Inaba, but that we'll get to that later, of course. But Very interesting in concept. Maka could call Nightmare Painter from the deck, so you could actually do this relatively. Well, I can't even say it was consistent, but you had some tools to kind of help here. Now let's talk about Nullity, or Knight of Nullity Masquerade. Now, Masquerade was a 9k base grade 2. It received 2 or 3k power when it attacked, as long as your Vanguard was a blaster. This was incredible for the time. Most grade 2s only capped at 11k power without counterblasting. A 12k boosted by most grade 1s would form at minimum an 18k column, which was obviously great against 13k bases. So it also made 20k columns with 8k boosters. Obviously this was good against 10k base Vanguards that still existed at this time. So overall, just very good. It could hit 11k base Vanguards without a boost, or even Majesty Lord Blaster, but we'll get back to that. So they were just great attackers, and they were free. So they were just auto includes in most decks that had them. Unfortunately, I think it was only 4 clans total that got these 12k attackers at first, so not super great, but this would become more standardized later in Breakrider in 2013, 2014. We'd start to see more of these, so you can look forward to that. But at the time, this was one of 4. Now lastly, Shadow Paladins would get a second critical trigger, which was huge for this deck's pressure. It had a rainbow trigger beforehand, and now you got to drop that stand trigger that doesn't really do anything for Shadow Paladins. And now you can play 8 crits. This was a massive boost for their pressure. And you know what? All of these support cards really did help the clan a lot, rocketing it from one of the worst decks in the format to an actually very solid tier 2 deck. No, you didn't hear that wrong. I said tier 2. We'll come back to that. The only thing that really held this deck back was PBO himself. Despite having that nice cross-ride bonus, his skill was just bad. Despite that, it still made its way into team events and even a few top cuts at regionals in 2012. Pretty solid tier 2 deck coming forward. Now it's finally time to discuss the Q4 clans. All 4 were supported. All 4 were fantastic. It's like it's a theme of the first year of Vanguard. Let's start with the stepchild though, right? We got to talk about Nova Grappler. I'm not a huge fan of Top Gun, and the strategy wasn't really that good. The main concept behind the new Vanguard Top Gun was to rest your Vanguards during the main phase to buff his power, and then restand them with a card effect. Anthrodroid could restand itself for a counterblast, and the Death Army cards could restand themselves when you drive check a grade 3, so you had access to these cards that could restand themselves, even if you rested them during the main phase. So they also blatantly wanted you to play stands, let me be very clear. They wanted Nova Grappler players to play stands. Whether you did or not was up to you, but stands weren't that great back then. Street Bouncer from this set, as well as Rocket Hammerman from Extra Booster 1, would be ways of resting your rearguards during that main phase to help boost Top Gun. And it was neat. Not super great, as you can imagine, but it was a cool little strategy. Street Bouncer, however, was a fantastic card. When placed on rearguard circle, you can rest itself and another Nova Grappler in the same column to draw 1 card. This was amazing. Not only was it free, all you had to do was give up an attack. Like, you gave up an attack on an early turn to get a free +1. That was fantastic for the time, especially with Nova Grappler, which really struggled with plussing. It was such a free, solid skill. You would see a lot of play in the first couple years of Vanguard. I even saw a few Victor lists playing it in early G. I'd see a few lists playing it. Of course, its relevancy was, it had a time span, but it was a very solid card for a long time. This clan also got their second draw trigger, and I cannot emphasize how badly this clan needed a second draw. Again, you're just struggling with card advantage in early Nova Grappler, and getting a second draw trigger, getting that Street Bouncer really helped fix the clan's biggest weakness. You pair this with the strong Blau support from set 4, and you had a very good solid rogue deck. Maybe not up to par with the meta, but this was fantastic for Nova Grappler as a whole. Oracle Think Tank is next. Tsukiyomi received a very solid wave of support, and it was already a strong deck to begin with. Battle Maiden Tagitsuhime was a 12k attacker similar to Masquerade from earlier, but it just needed 6 cards in Soul to achieve the condition. Obviously, this was easily met by playing Tsukiyomi, and was a nice offensive attacker for the deck. While White Hair of Inaba would be an okay card, it was really used to help achieve that 6 soul condition. I think it was intended to kind of help fix the soul if you misrode, but honestly, if you misrode, you miss the soul charge 2 off a half moon, so this card's not really helping much regardless in that regard, but it does help you get that 6 card in soul. Just better than Red Eye, which was it was Red Eye and Psychic Bird before that helped you get the 6 cards in soul, and obviously Red Eye needed to hit, so that was a little unreliable. So White Hair of Inaba was definitely useful in that regard for guaranteeing that 6 card in soul. Now, Battle Sister Ginger would be the 3rd critical trigger, and my goodness, it was a welcome addition. Tsukiyomi made a lot of card advantage, so it really didn't need draw triggers. But despite that, the clan only had 2 crits up until this point. So now you could cut that draw trigger and play 12 critical triggers. This was so good for the deck's pressure and offensive potential. Evil Eye Princess Uriel also came out here, but saw some fringe play because honestly Silent Tom was just a better finisher, as it was just no grade zeros when it attacked, and if you just stacked triggers on it by guaranteeing triggers with Tsukiyomi, you had a pretty good finisher here. Now, but Uriel was an option. Some people liked it, so they liked doing the whole crossing fingers and binding a card out of your opponent's hand, acting all cool, but it wasn't that good of a card. But this was a solid wave of support for an already meta archetype. Tsukiyomi would continue to be one of the strongest decks in the format. It would notably see a dip in early mid to 2012 in Japan, but quickly ramped back up at the end of the year, specifically with a dominating performance in the winter circuit. This is likely due to it being a challenging deck to play, players opting to take more consistent and or easier decks to pilot through multiple round tournaments during the major summer and fall tournaments. It would definitely feel much more optimized by the end of 2012, and of course we'll come back to that, but it definitely felt like it worked a lot harder to do the things that the meta decks wanted to accomplish. Next up, we have Kaguro, debatably one of the strongest clans in the format after this set. You wouldn't think it was that insane because it only got 4 cards in Japan and 5 cards in English, and the 5th card that it got in English wasn't even that impactful. But my goodness, did these 4 cards just really take the clan to a whole new level. Let's first talk about Flame of Promise Ermo. It was an okay searchable card via Lizard Soldier Conroe. It was a 10k booster for Overlords, as long as you had to pay a Soul Blast every turn, but this clan really didn't use Soul, so you were able to just burn that Soul and have a easy 10k booster. Very nice. Of course, it would work with cards like Gatling Claw and Kimnara, which would feed the Soul as well. So just a very good booster. And the fact that it was searchable was also nice, and the toolbox, the grade 1 toolbox of Kaguro in general just was very strong already, and it just got better. Burning Horn Dragon was a 12k attacker as long as you had Overlord Vanguard. We've already mentioned these cards before. This is the 3rd one. This was a very strong attacker. It also, it helps that there was some 6k boosters like Nara, and if you played the Heat Nail Salamander from set 4, same thing. These were 6k boosters. You made an 18k column with your Burning Horn and you'd go. So you get the idea, though. This is the 3rd time we're talking about it. I'm not going to talk too much about it again. So, now, with those out of the way, we could talk about a card that single-handedly put the whole clan on its back for years. Likely the most impactful card ever released for the Kaguro clan, Dragonic Overlord, the End. Possessing the same cross-ride skill as Phantom Blaster Overlord, the End was a 13k base as long as Dragonic Overlord was in the soul. This was even more insane for Kaguro than Shadows. The clan possessed many ways to retire rear guards. Kaguro could simply deny the opponent any boosters, and this was important as most attackers in the game couldn't hit 13k without a booster. And even if they could, the clan played multiple draw triggers to get card advantage, so guarding with 5ks was just so easy for those attacks that couldn't reach 18k. This allowed the deck to maintain card advantage against nearly every deck in the game. And that's just the first skill. We're not even at the second half of the skill. The other half of the skill is also incredibly strong. When its attack hits, Counterblast 2, discard a copy of itself, Persona Blast, restand it, and that's it. Doesn't lose drives. It doesn't even have to hit Vanguard. That's absurd. It's like Sternblau Kluger, but way better. This was an insane skill. It forced your opponent to either A, deny this skill by heavily guarding him, and then, you could just use your Counterblast on Berserk Dragon to retire their rear guards and not ever let them hit your Vanguard, or they let the End hit, and you drive check that second copy you'd been digging for, and you get a restand, and oh wow, that's just a +1 in card advantage and an extra Vanguard swing, 4 drives. Yeah, that's crazy for this time. Absolutely insane. With Airmo as a booster, you hit 23k column, so this was good against the mirror, and it really did feel like one of the best decks in the game. Either way, the End just puts your opponent in such a bad situation. It's just any one of these two skills honestly would have been good. Like, if it had just been a cross-ride, it still would have been good. But the fact that it had both was insane. Overlord the End was considered one of, if not the best deck for the entirety of 2012. It would even see play into Break Ride era in 2013, eventually taking the gold at the World Championship that year. Talk more about that later, though. Now, let's discuss Bushiroad's favorite clan, Royal Paladins. This was an insanely good wave of support for an already meta deck, as if this clan needed more. Where do we even start with this? Wingall Brave was one of the strongest forerunners ever printed. When an attack hits during a battle that it boosted a unit with Blaster in its name, you could put it into the soul and search your deck for any one card with Blaster in its name. What an absurd search skill, and it was free. Keep in mind, Majesty Lord Blaster, your big main Vanguard, searchable. Blaster Blade, searchable. Any Blaster card ever released in the future, searchable. Like, it was just so easy. And the only condition is that whatever it boosted had to be a Blaster name. Big whoop. But anyways, this is just extremely useful consistency tool. It would be so strong. You could even make an argument for playing it in Modern Premium. Let's go ahead and move on from that, because that card's crazy. Starcall Trumpeter would be another solid Blaster consistency card. Not necessarily the best one, but on place, on Rearguard Circle, you can Counterblast 2, search your deck for a grade 2 or less Blaster, and call it to Rearguard Circle. It helped a little bit with consistency. It was a solid card. Some decks would opt to play 1 or 2 of it. A lot of people saw, though, that Counterblast could be paid on other better effects. Some of these, it was a little more consistent if you just didn't play it and you just played 4 Blaster Dark, 4 Blaster Blade. Yes, I said Blaster Dark. We're going to come back to that if you don't know why. But yeah, it's just there's better things you could use Counterblast on, so some would opt to play it, some would not. It was an okay consistency tool if you played it. Knight of Friendship K and Knight of Loyalty Bedivere are a nice pair of attackers. Obviously, Bedivere is just another one of those 12k attackers, and it even had the same condition as Masquerade. You just had to have a blaster named Vanguard. K, however, Knight of Friendship K was ahead of his time. He was a grade 1, and he gained 3k when he attacked if you had a blaster Vanguard. So he's a 10k attacker. Now, that's incredible on a grade 1, because it allows you to put easy early pressure on even grade 2 Vanguards, or even grade 3 if they had a 10k base, on just a grade 1 for absolutely free. Yeah, it didn't get, the power boost when it boosted, but just as like an aggro card, this was phenomenal. It's almost as if Royal Paladins was already an aggro deck, and it got more aggro tools. Fantastic. We wouldn't get these grade 1s that gain 3k across the board until Break Right era. There was a Neo Nectar one, a Musketeer specifically, that was a 10k attacker on grade 1, but that's pretty much the only exception to this. Those grade 1s that swung for 10k really didn't come until 2013, so it'd be a very long time before other clans got access to cards like this. Just another way of showing Royal Paladin favoritism. Thanks. Now, this, it'd eventually be a common card, but we finally reached the card that really just pushed Royals even farther over the top, right? It was already a good deck. It was already got good support, but let's just tip it over the edge. The season ender, the game ender, and the most blatant example of offensive power creep, Majesty Lord Blaster, MLB for short. MLB had 2 insane skills. Blaster Blade and Blaster Dark were in its soul. It gained plus 2k and 1 critical continuously. Yes, that plus 1 critical is continuous. Yeah. When it attacked, you can move Blaster Dark and Blaster Blade from rearguard circle into its soul. And if you did, it gains 10,000 power. That, of course, would turn its continuous skill online, so you'd have a 22k attacker with an extra crit, which was insane levels of power for this time. No other deck was hitting this level of power, and with this many crits for the most part, unless you got lucky. This was just so big, and it did it so easily and so consistently. I don't even know where to start. Royal Vanguards all had 10k base at the time, so it only got to 12k instead of 13, which, a little annoying that it didn't get to 13, but honestly, even just being at 12 was good. The problem really wasn't the 12k base. The problem was the continuous critical. Just having a 2 crit base was insane for the time. So even if you didn't get the 10,000 power buff that he would get from his skill, it was still just crazy to have a Vanguard with a base critical of 2, because it just meant your opponent really had to try and guard that Vanguard swing, which was really hard to do, as I previously mentioned. So now you're just like, the moment you were at 3 damage, you're just at risk of dying each time MLB attacks. It's just terrifying. Pair this with the 12 criticals the clan had access to, the great slew of early aggro cards, and fantastic consistency tools. It was just a nightmare to play against. To top this off, it gained an obnoxiously high 10k power by using its skill, and that cost no counterblast to do. That was just such a crazy level of power for free. Remember Phantom Blaster Overlord? He had to freaking counterblast 3 and discard a copy for his skill. Why was this card so good? It's just, MLB was just, its critical was just static. You just didn't have to pay for it. Once you got the condition, it was just there. Fantastic. But hey, you have to play Blaster Dark, right? Don't worry about it. Windgull Brave or Starcall can search it. You worried about clan rules, that being an issue? Nah, don't worry about it. They made a special rule for Blaster Dark when we got to clan rules that stated you could play up to 4 copies of Blaster Dark in a Royal Paladin deck. So that was never an issue. And I don't know, like I said earlier, Vanguard Brave can just search copy MLB, or it can search one of the pieces that you need. It was just so consistent. You think that 12k isn't a good number? Well, just wait until you hear that Royals had a 9k booster with Toy Poogle. As long as you had another grade 3 on the rearguard circle, which you definitely would, we'll get to that in a second, it was just a 9k booster. That's a 21k column. Yes, and Akane was a card that some decks would play because Akane could just call Toy Poogle from the deck. Worried about Dragonic Overlord the end in that 13k base? Yeah, remember Paladins? I don't know if you watched the set 3 video, but check it out. Paladins is a 13k base on rearguard circle. It just required you to have 2 grade 3 units. So it could just be itself and then the MLB, which is obviously going to be on your Vanguard circle. So it's just a free 13k attacker for no cost. You could hit Dragonic Overlord the end without a boost. Fantastic. Alright, we're already, going toe-to-toe with the best deck in the format. Honestly, the Royal Paladin toolbox was just so rich at this point. It was so strong. No other clan in the game had this level of support. And MLB was really just the push it needed to blow all of its competition out of the water. MLB had success that rivaled Dragonic Overlord the Index for all of 2012, together being the top 2 decks. And he even took down the Japanese national tournament in 2012. A true force to be reckoned with, and ultimately led to an offensive power increase in this game. Now that's it for the card list. I know that was pretty long. Certainly took a while to say. I'm kind of running out of, my voice is kind of going out here because I had to talk about so much. But if you haven't figured it out yet, Dragonic Overlord the End, aka Dote, and Majesty Lord Blaster, aka MLB, really were the best decks after set 5. It wasn't really that close. Tsukiyomi came in at a hard-earned 3rd, but it definitely was a much more difficult deck to pilot, and it had to, you really had to play it very, very well if you wanted to compete in this format. Phantom Blaster Overlord, certainly a great deck, but it was just going to fall short of these top 3, coming in at a solid tier 2 deck. I do think, though, if this format had been more explored, I really think that Trailing Rose or Blau would have actually seen some varying degrees of tier 2 play. Definitely not at that same level as the tier 1 decks, but I think they would have had some nice tier 2 play. We just didn't have a lot of time in the set 5 format from a competitive perspective before set 6 came out, and set 6 really did have a pretty good impact on your tier 2 decks. Now, with that being said, Kaguro and Royals would definitely remain one of the top 2 clans for a very long time. And that's Awakening of Twin Blades in a nutshell. A truly insane set. Not many sets have this many good cards, so this episode might run a little bit long. But if you hung out until the end, I do want to let you know how much I appreciate you for supporting the channel and our ever-evolving content as we get better and better at this kind of thing. Next time, it's going to be a much shorter episode. We're just going to briefly cover the Bermuda Triangle Extra Booster. There's not really too terribly much to talk about there, but, it is interesting to a degree. It was the first clan to get its own set just dedicated to itself, so we'll definitely talk about it. If you enjoy this content, consider subscribing, checking out some of the other great content. We've got fight nights, anime reactions, top 10s, but give us a watch, and I'm sure you won't be disappointed. Otherwise, I'll see y'all next time, and have a lovely start to your new year. Bye bye.